This is Ask an Expat with Marcus and Matt from An Expat's Russia, where we answer your questions about what it's like to live, work, and travel in Russia. Hey everyone, in this video we're going to discuss the ideal expat life after having lived over 15 years in Russia between the two of us. So I have 3 children now. Matt, you have a kid after moving from Russia to the U.S.
Yep.
And we talk about going back to Russia. What kind of circumstances would have to happen for you to make that move?
Sure. I think the number one thing, it has to be, you have to have a remote job. If you're going to live in Russia, having a remote job gives you incredible flexibility. Living in Russia is great, but there are some real downsides. And one of the big downsides for me personally is having to work in a Russian company. I'm not saying that there are no good companies to work at as an expat, but if you're working as a expat that is sent to Russia, then this doesn't apply. Obviously, you're going to have a different situation.
Right.
But if you're going to go to Russia and essentially work like a Russian, but you're hired, it's really tough. The Russian bureaucracy and hierarchy within companies is very different than what Americans are used to. In my experience, lots of Russian companies like to pretend that they are very Western and open-minded and this and that, but and by doing that, they will solicit everybody's input in meetings and whatnot. But in Russian business culture, that's not generally accepted, right? Like nobody. I always found that when I was working in Russia, I was the only one who was giving their kind of opinion on projects when it was asked of the group, and I always thought that was weird. But really, it's because they're asking, but they don't actually want your opinion, especially you as the
Right.
American guy. So that was very hard to get used to, and that was very frustrating. If I had a remote job, it would be very different. You would avoid all of that. And then alongside that, you do butt heads with Russian managers. Again, if you're coming in as a senior manager, that's not probably going to be the case. Your subordinates are going to be Russian, and that shouldn't be any problem. I loved working with Russians, but working for Russians was very difficult as an American. I mean, I'm just telling it
Right.
how my experience was. So if I were to go back to
No, I've
Russia,
heard that from quite a few people.
so if I were to go back to Russia, the number one factor definitely remote job. If I was working a remote job or working for myself online and I was location independent, it has to be one of those two options. So that's the
Hmm.
first thing. The second thing is obviously salary level, and we can get into that. But what about you? Um,
I just wanted to make a point to what you said. Um, a lot of people are comfortable working a lot of foreigners are comfortable working at their position um, in Russia to a certain point. I mean, their entry level or a little bit higher, but the growth opportunities for foreigners, for expats at Russian jobs is kind of, there's a low ceiling, I would say, unless you break off and do your own thing, you start your own
right.
company.
Well, I
So
can say, how about
I've
this?
heard that many times that,
I can
yeah.
share my experience as to why I decided to come back to the United States. It wasn't because I wanted to leave Russia. It was because in my career, I found that increasingly companies in Russia were looking at me as a native English speaking Russian. So when I would go to an interview, I had a lot of experience in Russia. I had a lot of experience in a law firm, which is what I did and still do, work in business development at law firms. But they didn't value that experience. The thing that companies value in Russia is foreign experience, bringing it to Russia, right? So I just felt that all of the companies were looking at me and they were saying, well, this guy's got a lot of experience, but it's all in Russia. So he's really a Russian for all intents and purposes. So
Right.
at the end of the day, they were looking at me like a native English speaking Russian candidate. And I felt that that was
Hmm.
limiting my career opportunities. I think now, if I were to go back to Russia, they would look at me very different. I have a job at a very good American law firm, or actually international law firm, experience in Russia, or and now experience in the United States. If I were to go back to Russia, companies would look at me very differently. So I think you
Right.
have this balance, right? If you start your career in Russia, you have to understand that your experience is not international. As much as Russian companies like to talk about and tout their companies like working with international companies and with international clients, at the end of the day, it is different, especially when you're talking about career advancement. Now, if you go to Russia as a mid-level professional, then that is going to put you at a different sort of starting point, right? Because they're already hiring you as someone who they think has international experience.
Hmm. I never. I worked for in the field of teaching English and English coaching for Russian companies, and I communicated with a lot of managers. A lot of just HR managers, higher level, higher level executives, and I always got the feeling that they could kind of the Russian approach to things, the Russian mentality was holding their company
Mm-hmm.
back to expanding. Um, I mean, some of them have had very good products or
Right,
services, and I just thought they couldn't break through kind of the break out of that Russian mindset, and it was just limiting their
right,
growth. Um, and I think a lot of foreigners they go to Russia just to experience it, whether it's English teaching or whatever, and then I'm talking about non-professional,
yep,
so they'll an entry level job or something, they study in Russia and then they say, oh, this is great, I want to stay, but they leave because or they have to leave or feel like they have to leave because they can't grow at any of the companies that are offering them
right,
positions. So
right. Well,
they're not going to get a manager
right,
position. They're not going to get anything like at an executive level because the Russians will all, um, occupy those
right,
positions.
right. I think it's possible if you come in at a mid to senior level manager, you can make it to the executive level, especially in an international company in Moscow. If you speak Russian,
Right.
I don't see really any barrier to that. The problem is starting from the very bottom without any kind
Yeah.
of global experience. Most companies that's going to hurt you, and that was my experience, and
Hmm.
that's why I came back. And I would love to go back to Russia, actually.
So uh, I was self-employed in Russia. I didn't work, as an employee in a lot of places. I was an English professor at a
Mm-hmm.
university. Um, I know that that's not a real good comparison, but the bureaucracy there really was off-putting.
Yes.
I loved the students. I loved my
Well,
colleagues,
that's what I said.
but
If you remember what I said working with Russians is fantastic. That is something I miss every day at my job in the United States. It's just the camaraderie that you
I
have with
think I think it
Russians.
was even better. I think it was even more interesting overall than working with in the U.S. with the U.S. team.
100% agree. 100% agree. The problem is not working with Russians, but working for
Right.
Russians. Now, I think this is
So
changing,
let's.
though. I think it's changing because the younger Russians are now becoming the managers. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, it will be quite a bit better. But well, obviously, time will tell. Will tell.
Right. Let's get into then the ideal expat life, in all aspects. So like you're satisfied with your work, you're satisfied with your standard of living. I know we've talked about this before. For me to really go back to Russia, I want the flexibility of working for
Mm-hmm.
myself or a remote position where I could, if I were a subordinate, I would want to work with somebody Western
Right.
minded, just because I would want to kind of avoid all of the miscommunication, even though we would speak the same language,
Right.
right? If it were a Russian manager, it still wouldn't be the same. So, but I would definitely need a remote position, and then that would give me the flexibility. Having lived in Moscow, I could choose where I'd want to live and be free from kind of the rush hour traffic. And
That's another
what about
another
you?
big benefit. So if I were to move back to Moscow, I think the only way I could ever convince my wife to do it would be to have a remote job or have my own company that we were doing, and live far from the city center. You know, live in a nice area of Moscow,
Right.
but not right in the hustle bustle. You want to be close enough that you can get to Moscow on the weekend, take advantage of all the restaurants and the stores and things to do, but you want to be far enough away that it's quiet and you have some space, which is definitely possible. You just need to have
Mm-hmm.
a decent income. I usually say that I would need probably $7,000 a month to be able to go back to Russia and have the same type of life that I have here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe obviously there's going to be some trade-offs, right? But more or less, I think $7,000 would give me the life that I would want to have in Moscow. Now, if I was completely remote and didn't depend on Moscow whatsoever, I think you could live on significantly less and have an awesome life in a smaller Russian city.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, um, as far as our family, at that time when I was in Moscow in 2019, I had two kids. Now I have a young boy as well. So for three kids, 5-person family, I would I would need to be making, around 90,000 or more a year to make it worth it. And
Dollars,
the
right?
only reason $90,000 a year or more, and the only reason really is I would have to, you know, plan on my kids going to a private
Yeah,
school, which would be the biggest cost. So you'd win in you'd pay less in income tax, for example, but and much less in healthcare.
right. The problem is
But
the
you know
trade-off is school.
you're yeah. So but I did calculate how much, when we were leaving Russia, how much we needed kind of to live comfortably
Hmm.
there. It was for a 4-person family, it came to about $60,000 in
Hmm.
Moscow. So we had a car. We lived about 20 minutes south of Red Square on the
Hmm.
subway, and the school was nearby. I was paying for a private school um, for two kids.
Right,
But anything less than that would be a
right.
stretch, right? So now having five, I'd only go back if it was 90 plus a year. So like yeah, around the same thing, same level. But let's kind of illustrate what you could get for that.
Sure. Well, I think in terms of accommodation, if you were making $7,000 a month, for example, you could easily spend 2,000, which is what 150,000 rubles a month on accommodation. You could get whatever you want. If you want to be in the center, you could get probably a 4-bedroom, really nice, nicely remodeled apartment. If you wanted to live outside the center, I think you're probably close to being able to rent a decent townhouse. Maybe not like an international in an international neighborhood, but like a Russian style townhouse with a little garage and 2 or 3 floors, maybe 150 square meters. I think that's doable. Or you could probably go further
Right.
out and even get a house. You definitely wouldn't be able to get a house walking distance from the metro, but you could easily probably find a house that was a short drive away from um, a metro
You
station.
could get on the train line.
Or I was going to say on the electrichka, you could probably get a house within walking distance of an electrichka somewhere. If you wanted to be outside the MCOD, which is the ring road in Moscow, just outside. We're not talking hundreds of kilometers away, but
Right.
so I think in terms of housing
I would say
for that type of salary, you could get just about anything.
if you're in the salary range of, $6,000, $7,000 a month or more, you're not limited financially by you're not limited by choice based on your finances. So you could rent anywhere you want, pretty much, and the limitation would be your preferences. So if you prefer kind of a city life, you're close to shopping centers and um, theaters and entertainment, then you could get a very nice spacious apartment in the city. And then if you have a family, you need more space, then you could rent a townhouse or even a house within 45 minutes or so by car or by train, um, to the center or to a main station, within, I would say, 150 or 200,000 rubles a month.
Right.
Um, so if I were to go back with my family, I would actually consider renting a townhouse or purchasing one, and kind of living outside the city a little bit.
Right. No, and I would do exactly the same. Once you have kids, you don't have any time really to go to bars or restaurants with friends anyway, so it doesn't make sense to pay the premium to be there. It's easier just to take a taxi the once in a blue moon that you're going to do it. Um, so yeah, I would agree with that, Marcus. Trying to think what else would you might want to think about if you were deciding whether we wanted to go back.
Well, a lot
I
of
mean, really,
people
it's
say they don't need a car, for example, but
yeah,
I found that a car was super helpful, and I couldn't do without a car. If I went back to Russia, I would still have a car. If you have kids, more than one kid, it's tough to get around without a car because you want to go do fun things with your kid, and
right,
so and driving in Moscow is not that bad. Some people are scared, and it's aggressive, but you can get used to it.
yeah. I never had a problem driving, though I didn't drive every day. Um, yeah, I think you're right. We need to have location independence, whether that was a remote job or our own company, to support ourselves. We'd need to have $6,000-7,000 a month, and you'd probably want a car. I mean, those are kind of the things that would make living in Russia great, Moscow especially.
Hmm. Right. And you and I have been starting this new project, xmote.com, to help
Yep.
people who have remote jobs. They can keep their remote jobs and work in Russia completely legally, get a work visa,
Mm-hmm.
and with this globalization of people working pretty much anywhere they want, this is and the ruble being very low or being
Mm-hmm.
very weak, this is really the right time to think about possibly moving to Russia if you have a real interest in Russian, of course,
Right.
in the language, in the culture, in living in Russia. Um, if you have a remote job, you could probably live anywhere nowadays because due to COVID, kind of pushing that to be
Right.
an option for most employers.
Right. Right. So you'll hear more about it from us in the future. We are just starting this new project, Xmote. You can find a link in the description below, and let us know what you think of our comments on what it would take for us to go back to Russia. This was Ask an Expat with Marcus and Matt from An Expat's Russia. We hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have a question about Russia, let us know in the comments. We'll answer it in the video.